rags to riches, transformation. It always makes for a good movie.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. Do we have to do his name again?
Pardon me?
Do we have to do his name and all that again for the?
Just the name.
Yeah.
Just the name.
All right, Jim. Would you just say your name and go ahead and throw in the years you were here again? One time.
I'm Jim Nixon, and I was here at Grace from 1992 to 1998.
Now, how did you arrive at the church? What was the search process like? What were you doing at the time?
I was a vicar of St. Thomas the Apostle Episcopal Church in Humboldt, Tennessee. It was a wonderful congregation, but it wasn't the right place for Joan and Katie and Matt. The school systems were not that good. So the bishop who ordained me asked me to stay at least for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, I started looking. I was convinced that God was going to call me to the East Coast, so I spent time in Connecticut and New York and Rhode Island and all those meeting deployment officers. Came home, and there was a letter from Grace Church, New Lenox, Illinois. I remember asking my wife, Joan, and said, "Oh, do you think we could live in Chicago area?" She said, "We've lived every place else. We could live there as well." So I replied to the letter, and one thing led to another, and search committee came to Humboldt, and it was kind of, I think we fell in love with them and they fell in love with us. I remember one of the great apocryphal stories is they were staying at a hotel in Jackson, Tennessee along Interstate 40. And they got up, the two women were sharing a room, they got up, opened the blinds one morning, and as they did, there was a tractor trailer headed west toward Memphis, and the whole tractor trailer said Nixon. And they reported that at breakfast and said, "We think it is a sign."
What was the church like? What was kind of the state of either the building, the grounds, the parish? Do you remember the parish, the mission? What do you remember when you kind of first arrived? Sure. Hold that thought. The little things. I gotta be careful not to react too loudly too. Let's hear this phantom voice laughing.
Laughing's okay, but make sure that Jim finishes his thought.
Exactly.
So a lot of times people tend to step
Yeah.
up.
Don't be offended if I'm quiet. I'm just stunned aside.
That's all right.
So I think I was asking, what was the state of the church like, either physically or among the congregation when you arrived? What do you remember?
The physical building was clearly needed work. It was when we first arrived, the first time I saw Grace Church, it took me back a little bit in terms of how much work it did seem to need, and that was just superficial. I mean, obviously, I couldn't tell underneath, but it needed painting. It needed clearly needed lawn work, parking work. It just needed a lot of work. And I think in many ways that was the state of the congregation too. The leave taking of the previous vicar had been traumatic, and I believe that they were ripe for someone to come and love them, and for them to learn to trust, which I think is, if there's anything that characterizes the years I was here, I would say that the love that we built between one another and the trust that we built.
Do you remember any kind of culture shock about being in the Midwest, being from the South? You said you were feeling pulled towards the East.
No. I mean, Joan was raised in Cincinnati. I was raised in Pennsylvania. We had lived in Memphis, in Tennessee for 12 years. So no, it was kind of like coming back home for us.
I'm skipping around on my questions too. How did was there anything about Grace's history that seemed kind of interesting to you at the time? So at that time would have been around the 125th year. Was that kind of in the air, so to speak, or in the zeitgeist around here?
I think it was, but I think it was more when we came, it was more immediate history that was very present to them. I remember having lunch, shortly after I arrived, I had lunch with Bishop Griswold's chief of staff, Carl Godot. And I'll never forget sitting at lunch and having him tell me that if I hadn't taken the position, they were thinking about closing Grace Church, which I had never really heard a word about. And I'm not even really sure that Grace Church knew that. So, I mean, I think it was everything that we were doing was immediate. So I don't think we had a long view of 100 years. We had a long view of the last decade and what's the next decade look like.
Do you have any, what do you remember about New Lenox, just the area? It's kind of a peculiar town. I'm starting to call it a suburb. So what do you remember about the area having lived here?
It was not a suburb when we moved here. I think the thing I remember most about New Lenox, there was a culture shock in some sense to us, was of course the vicarage lives 2 blocks from the train station. So at 5:35 every morning was our wake-up call, and so getting used to an area that was this odd combination of ready to grow into a suburb, linked to a great city, yet very, very farm, rural kind of set. So there was a lot of transition during the first few years that I was here. There's a lot of growth during that time. So, but it was still kept all of its, shall we say, rural charm. Meaning people were very welcoming, they wanted to know you, they wanted to greet you, have you in their homes, and that sort of thing.
Do you think there is a kind of a bond between this church and the community? Like, you know, it seems to me that the church is almost as old as New Lenox, so that maybe they kind of seem like twins that kind of orbit each other a little bit, or would you?
Yeah, I think there was, and as far as I can tell, that there still is. I mean, we did a lot of things with the community. I was on the board of directors of the chamber. We did a food booth at the local fair every year. And so there was a lot of interaction between Grace Church and the community at that time.
Tell me about the ham dinner. What first comes to mind when you hear ham dinner?
Organized chaos. It was a wonderful thing to do, but trying to seat as many people as we did. I mean, I'm not sure of numbers, but I think we would serve well over 200 or 300 people for lunch, and the space seemed always inadequate. We had enough space for people to sit, but trying to have people serve and in the kitchen. And so by the time the ham dinner ended at 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, everyone would be completely exhausted. And every year there was the inevitable conversation, shall we do it again? And you just told me that the last one was the spring that I left. And I believe the conversation after that was the same, shall we do it again? And it became less and less, it became difficult to raise money with it. You know, it's kind of like selling donuts to build a battleship kind of thing. And it was much more of a community building event for us.
I'm reminded that Conrad's dear wife, our senior warden, said we should try to get you to rephrase some of the questions in your answer. And so I'm going to ask you not the same question, but would you mind, to the best you can, just kind of explaining where the ham dinner came from? But if you wouldn't mind, start with saying, you know, the ham dinner was a tradition, or blah, blah, blah.
The ham dinner was a tradition, a long-standing tradition when I arrived here. I don't know how many years it had been going on, but I think it was a continuation, an outgrowth of the church being connected to agricultural. You know, it's sort of a rural church where chicken dinners and fish fries and that sort of thing were a normal part of their life. Why ham? I could not address. Other than the fact that we always did it in the spring. It happened around Easter, a little bit after Easter, ham being a tradition of Easter. And so, twice baked potatoes. So there were a number of things that were tradition. It was very difficult to change the menu because the tradition was that it was ham and double baked potatoes and that sort of thing. And it was always, we would have people go out and sell tickets, but it became, mostly a family affair. People would be here who were here every year, but that was their connection. That was their connection with Grace Church. To tell you the truth, I don't know that we ever completely or adequately mined its potential as a evangelistic affair. Being typical Episcopalians, we didn't want to get too pushy about people being here. But people came, and that was they would be asking when it was going to be, and it was something the community planned around.
When you were here, was the tradition still happening with the people would bake bread and deliver it to homes door to door? Does that sound right?
It had just begun when we were.
Could you address the question in that answer? Because we're not going to hear the questions in the video.
Again,
So,
you did it perfectly on the ham dinner. So, so maybe something like the tradition of bringing bread to the homes.
We worked together to develop a number of new traditions centered around evangelism. One of them was we would go out and actually knock on people's doors. We had flyers. If they weren't home, we'd leave it at the door. If they were home, we'd have a little speech about, we're from Grace Church, and we wonder if you have a church home. And so as part of that, we decided that we would bake loaves of bread, because we were using real bread anyway for our Eucharist. And so we extended that ministry, baked those loaves, and when people did come, we would have it to give them and to visit their homes afterward.
When you look at the sanctuary now, it's been renovated maybe at least once since you left. What comes back to you about what it looked like when you were here? And I would probably phrase it by beginning saying, when I was here, the church looked like X, Y, Z or something, or I remember.
Yeah. When I was here, the church amazingly looked very similar to where it does. I think there are some new lights, but the lights, the surface-mounted lights above me were all put in when I was here. What strikes me when I look around the church now, and it was the same then, is that there's evidence of people's love for this place. Because a lot of the stuff, the hangings in the front, the hanging here, I'm sure have been made by the members of the congregation. And I remember that effort getting underway, the first set of vestments, and I assume some of those vestments are still around, were made with Joan's help and a lot of people gathering together. So what I see in the congregation is the love and the care that we have as the church. Now, the one thing that is a funny story that I will tell you is different is I see that the flags are in the back of the sanctuary. I tried to move the flags out of the chancel area to the back, and a friend who is, to his dying day, was one of my best friends, was adamant he was going to the bishop if I made that move. So whoever made that move, I congratulate you for that.
And from what I understand, it was not a pleasant decision, but I agree that they're back where they belong, right. That's for sure. Do you have a favorite story or maybe an anecdote involving any particular parishioners, and you can use them by name, and maybe preface it by saying, I remember, or being in here reminds me.
Oh, I need some time on this one.
Take your time, that's all right. I can go to other questions too. Can you recall the decision and kind of the background to why the church had to be, the foundation had to be worked on? You were here for that.
As I said earlier, when I arrived, the infrastructure was really in bad shape. There's no other way to put it. But combined with that, we began to grow. And as we began to grow, we needed more space. And so we started considering all sorts of adding on to the parish hall. We considered using the vicarage in the mornings for classes. And the Undercroft area was completely underused because it was wet all the time, and it sometimes had 4 to 6 inches of water in it. And it was Bill Sikowski. And Bill was the one that said, what about the possibility of putting a new foundation underneath the church? And that began a lot of the dreaming about what that space could look like. And one of the things I remember the most is, and I think this is a story about who Grace Church is Bill's company did all the excavation, all the pilings that we needed to lift the church up and that sort of thing. But I remember him being out here every day with the backhoe operator saying, "This is my church. You better not touch it the wrong way." And I think that's very characteristic of who people are in association with this building. One of my great remembrances, I came home one night, dark, the work lights were on underneath, the church had been lifted successfully. We only lifted it about 4 inches up off the foundation, and there was a glow from underneath the church. It was like a Star Wars, the Grace Church had afterburners and was about to lift off. And in many ways, it was, because it gave us the space to begin to introduce catechesis to the Good Shepherd, to continue to develop our youth program.
Something you said reminded me that recently celebrated your 70th birthday, is that right?
I did,
and
yeah.
some of our parishioners were there, right? Which I
Right.
think is fabulous. And I think part of the family aspect of Grace is that, we kind of buck that old trend that when a priest leaves, it's like, pretend they were never here, or,
Right.
we just kind of turn the page, and you stayed in contact. Do you want to say anything more about that, but maybe when you move back after the next call, how some of the people stayed in touch?
Yeah, I think in leaving Grace Church, it was a traumatic leaving for me because we had fallen in love. But it also was right. It was right for me to move on to next congregation. There were people that were not happy that I was leaving, and you may have heard about that from some of them. I have to honestly say there have been times when I look back upon the decision and wondered if I left too soon. But I'm not a kind of person to go and replay all of that. But we had such wonderful relationships. It just seemed unwise. It just didn't seem the right thing to do, to just drop those relationships. But it was difficult to maintain them, but also respect those who succeeded me. But now I think we're far enough away from when I was here that we have some friends that will be, they're friends now for 25 years, and they'll be friends the rest of our lives. And it doesn't have anything to do with Grace. It found its beginning and its birth in our relationship here, but it's moved far beyond.
This might be a tricky question too, but give it a moment. When you hear the church is now 150 years old, what does that mean to you? What kind of feelings does that stir up, that it's made it this far? And see if you can
Yeah,
answer the question, too.
it's really a great question. What does it mean to be 150 years old? And I just came from celebrating Eucharist at a senior living facility, and I was telling them I was coming here. And I said, in the whole scheme of things, 150 years, especially in light of European churches and that sort of, is not much. Yet I think about Grace Church, and I think about the impact that they have had in this community over 150 years. It's hard to really wrap my mind around the number of lives they have touched, whether those lives sat in this facility or whether they were ministered to by this congregation. And my great hope for Grace is, under your leadership and the leadership of those who will follow you, that there'll be another 150 years. I think one of the great assets of the Episcopal Church, and you get me on my bully pulpit now, is small congregations like this. I wish we did a better job of supporting them and raising them up and celebrating them, because they're the ones, like Grace Church for 150 years, who have put a human face and a human touch on the gospel.
Yeah, you narrate, it's like we'll just like use him as the narrator, right? Practically. It's true that I think you'd share the same sentiment. When I started, I had a vestry retreat at the vicarage, and I pitched to them this whole media line that the Episcopal Church is in decline, and I said, that may be true in some places, but we don't have to succumb to that, In fact, we can buck that trend. So,
I personally feel like the age of the megachurch is coming to an end, and it's not imminent, but we just look at what's going on at Willow Creek, and I think those churches are going to diminish, and the churches like these are still going to be the ones that baptize babies and celebrate weddings and do all those wonderful things.
That 6 baptisms this year, it's incredible. So, let me say, you kind of answered most of these questions. What was grace for you? Any other, any parishioners' names sticking out to you, or should I throw out a few names and you can just kind of wax? Yeah. What about Dave and Debbie Poole? I know they've been here for a while.
Dave and Debbie are, I mean, Dave, I'll tell you a story about Dave. He was on the search committee looking for you. They didn't know that it was you they were looking for. But Dave, I was on my way to Maine last year, and the phone in the car rang, and it was Dave Poole. And I thought, Dave Poole. So I didn't answer because I was driving, so I got to the hotel and called him back and realized it was the Dave Poole. And at that moment, I realized that for as long as I had known Dave Poole, I think it was the first time I ever spoke to him on the phone. And which says a lot about who Dave is. He's the quiet giant behind a love for this building and for the congregation. Debbie is the sort of the front person for the Poole family. One of the wonderful things, of course, about being here is now seeing their kids grow up and that sort of thing. So,
do you want me to take a pause, get you some water?
No, I just need to. Another person that comes to mind, and Joan and I were recounting this story coming down, was Mary Morris. Mary was the matriarch of the congregation. And when I arrived, I'm guessing Mary was in her 70s, and when I left, she was probably in her early 80s. But Mary was a force to be reckoned with in a very, very positive kind of way. But one of the stories I remember fondly about Mary is we were having a vestry meeting one night. Joan had been trying to get in touch with Mary, but every time she called, the phone was busy. Finally, she called to have the telephone company see if there was anybody on the line, and they reported back that nobody was on the line. It was silent, but it was still busy. So Joan got worried about her. She lived right over near the cemetery. She was the warden of the New Atlantic Cemetery. And so she came over and whispered in my ear that she was concerned for Mary, that she couldn't get in touch with her. What I remember is we stopped the vestry meeting. The entire vestry marched over to Mary's house. And we surrounded Mary's house, banging on the door, Mary, Mary, come on. And finally we realized that we had to find her in the house. So somebody, I think it was maybe Debbie Poole, found 2 5-gallon buckets, empty buckets, paint buckets. We piled them on top of each other because we couldn't reach up, get high enough on the house to look in her bedroom window. And so they said, you So here the vicar stands up on these 2 paint cans with a flashlight, looking in. There's Mary Morse laying on the bed, turned out sound asleep. But as I shined the flashlight up and down, it caught her eyes and she jumped up out of the bed. And everybody was, "Oh my God, Mary is okay." And so we kind of got that all finished, and we came back here and we finished our Vester meeting. That is an apocryphal story about who Grace Church is. I believe they would do that even today to whoever they couldn't get in touch with. The other thing I learned was that Mary kept a loaded shotgun right next to her back door. So I was very careful about what I did about that kind of stuff ever after that.
I'm really gonna hold my laughter. This is priceless. It's stuff.
The other fond memory I have of Grace, and there are so many, over 6 years, there are just so many wonderful memories. I could fill tape after tape. Well, one of the wonderful things we did was we had developed a youth group, because my kids were, Matt was going into 7th grade, Katie was going into 10th grade when we moved here, and we wanted them to have a youth group. And so our youth group began to grow, and we began to gather people who were interested in that kind of thing. One of the first things we did was a mission trip to South Dakota. I had a classmate who had just been recently consecrated as Bishop of South Dakota. He connected us with a Native American reservation in South Dakota, and off we went with a van full of kids, 2 vans filled with kids and adults. And one of the things we did that week was we painted this little Episcopal church, painted it white, and then painted a red door on it on the reservation. And we stayed at a little campground, a sort of a parish hall with some rough cabins around it. But across the lake, the girls discovered that there was a Lutheran boys camp. So they were interested in what was going on the other side of the camp. The last day we were there, we invited the kids out from the Lutheran camp to our paint project. And we had a video of this. And one of the boys says to the girls, he says, "That red door is so red you can see it from outer space." And I think that's another apocryphal story about this congregation, that it may feel like a pinprick from the outer space, but it's not. It makes such a huge difference in the community of those who gather here and in the community they serve.
I was thinking one of your stories reminded me that a couple months ago, Marilyn Johnson did not come to church, and we thought she was supposed to. She was there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we had the same kind of. We didn't quite go to her house and stand on paint cans, but we tried to track her down, and it turns out she was on her motorcycle traveling somewhere. So.
Yeah. First time that Marilyn and Ed came to church, we were on it. After church we were headed to a White Sox game. We had hired a school bus, and I'll never forget all of us on the bus getting ready to drive to Chicago, and Marilyn and Ed leaving on their motorcycles, and us yelling, "Goodbye, come back and visit us next week, please." And of course they did, and they became very much a part of this congregation.
Sure did. I'm trying to think of another name to shoot at, and then we're probably winding up, right? I also need to go back to the Margot McDermott. She would have been here, so she wouldn't have been in politics at the time, right?
Right. Margot was working for, excuse me, Margot, I think she was working for Amoco or BP as a lawyer at that time. She was very much part of our life here. I mean, Margot worked really hard with us in terms of putting together how we did things with the vestry and all. And Ed, her husband, worked with me with the kids, and he invited us one of the great stories, he invited us to court one night downtown Chicago, and he kind of put us in the jury boxes, and the kids heard, as you might imagine, for Chicago, heard all sorts of stories, drug stories and all. But I remember the most is that after that, he took us to Little Italy and we had Italian food with them, and our kids still talk about that time. So, and we used to go out to Margot and Ed's house for picnics and part of meetings with the vestry and that sort of thing. So,
this would be just slightly on the sillier side, but do you remember anything that you tried to implement or do, small or large, that just drew the church's ire? Like maybe, for instance, I moved the Paschal candle, and the altar guild thought their hair was going to go on fire. So, did anything like that stick out to you?
the flag, I tried to move the flags out of the chancel area, and tried to explain why, because I don't believe just unilaterally doing things helps. But again, I think part of the culture of where we are just could not allow that, and I decided that was not as I would say, a ditch that I would die in. I don't remember. I mean, I think because the congregation really knew where they stood with the diocese, they were just open to just about anything. And combine that with, I don't think I'm off the wall with a lot of stuff that I do, we just made a great match. I mean, we grew significantly during that time. And I think for the most part, I'm sure that in the end, if I thought about it, there'd be some things we tried. But the macro changes we did worked. They worked for us.
Jim, mostly because I love your voice and the way you tell a story, but this might help just for telling the story so they don't just hear from my voice in the video, but a couple things we might want to do is explain briefly what a mission congregation is. Do you feel prepared to explain it in a couple sentences or so? Versus parish, or how?
Yeah.
And if not that, maybe if you're aware, if you remember any of the history of how the church kind of came to be in the beginning, it would be great. But if not, think about it.
Grace was a mission church when I arrived, and a mission church is a church that basically financially is not independent. That it needs financial help, and it's under the leadership of the bishop. And that's why you were called, and I was called, a vicar. We never dwelled on that a whole lot, and we did hope that we would move toward financial independence, but never quite got there because of all the remodeling work we were doing. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
I mean, canonically, I was trained by somebody who said, when you bring the cannons out, you've already lost the game. So.
I've heard that before. Yeah, well, no, it's something that we're headed towards in maybe the next year or two. But I need to kind of build a case to some like David Poole, let's say, we've always been this kind of underdog mission, so why change? And it's a good argument. So.
Yeah, I think in the time that I was here, we kind of emerged out of that underdog thing. So.
What about the banners? Do you have any? I'm sure the banners were in place long before you were here, right? The idea that the church was populated with homemade banners and all. Do you have any members of those?
Yeah, I do. I mean, Joan was my wife. Joan was very much a part of that banner making. We did some amazing things. They made the banners. They did the altar hangings. They did the vestments to match it, and so did a full set at that time. One of the fond memories I have is we had a tree that a barren tree, a deciduous tree, would bring in during Lent, and we would hang ornaments on it to work our way through Lent. And it had a purple banner that wove its way through the tree. And then, after the Easter Vigil and before Easter morning, Joan and I would come over here and we would take artificial dogwood flowers and paste those, hot glue them all over the tree so that overnight the tree would have bloomed. And we did those kinds of things together, and that was what I think really, really helped us grow and be who we were.
Thinking about the banner that actually just fell down recently, it might go on display. It says "Amazing Grace." This might just be a fun thing. It may not work, but do you remember any anecdotes about singing that hymn, or are you like me, where I appreciate it, but it's not my favorite hymn, and I've tried to help us kind of save it for special occasions.
No.
Okay, good. You're like, again, not the bitch you're gonna die in.
The story I have about that is that in the spring of '93, we had all of the great floods in southwestern Illinois, when the Mississippi River flooded. And that was one of the first things we did together as a community. We went and did flood relief. Mucked out houses, tore out guts and that sort of thing. It was messy, messy work. And we stayed at the Episcopal Church in Alton, Illinois. But during that time, a little kitten emerged out of one of the homes. And everybody decided that the kitten was homeless, and was more than likely. But that kitten came back, spent the rest of its life with Dave and Debbie Poole, and that kitten's name was Grace. So Grace always accompanied us whenever we were doing things like that.
Much better. We've got a baby here that's Ella Grace. I think she's named Grace for the church too. So I can't think of anything else. Is there anything?
What about, I was thinking about the Alton trip and Dorothy Cook and asking for money.
Oh, yeah.
We went to Alton for flood relief in the spring of '93 after the great floods of that river valley. And I had never been to a casino in my life. And so one night after we were done, we were sleeping on the floor. A group of the adults said, we're gonna go to the casino. Is that okay? I said, yes. They said, do you want to go? And I said, well, I don't know. So in the middle of everybody's sound asleep. They come up, they wake me up. Do you want to go? Joan said, go. Have a good time. So going onto the boat, I said to Dorothy Cook, now Dorothy, when we get in there, please don't call me Father Jim. Just call me Jim. And so we get onto the boat. She realizes that she has to get money. She forgot to bring her money. Across the whole boat, she screams, Father Jim, I need money. Well, Bishop Frank Griswold was our bishop at that time. He was adamantly against gambling. And so the joke was that I was going to get pulled over on the boat because Dorothy Cook had outed me as a priest taking his first gambling trip. We won nothing, of course.
That's brilliant. Sweet Dorothy. She's moving to South Carolina to be close to her son.
Is she?
Yeah,
Okay.
in grocery
I had
store.
heard she wasn't doing well.
She was okay, but
Yeah.
housing was the issue. So
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah, there's lots of stories there.
that's true.
Yeah,
That's
so
true.
we're not going to go into those
We're
on
working
video.
on the memorial garden now. Since you've been here, there's been funding for a garden somewhere in the back there, and some rumors, but nothing was written down that the Cooks wanted to be made into trees or something. So we've got to sort through all of that fun stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think there's anything else, right?
The questions I had you asked.
Good, fabulous. And some of those anecdotes, thanks for playing along.
Oh, you're welcome.
I just think if we can find photos of some of these things, like, it'd be awesome. Maybe the kitten.
Yeah,
Are there
I'll
any
take a
photos
look.
of the Alton trip?
There's got to be, but I have to go through. When we moved, we had to downsize. So I pretty much know where stuff is, and there's a lot of stuff that I can't put my finger on, but I'm gonna look, because I've got some
If
photo
you can.
boxes.
Well,
I'll
this is
do
also
that
helpful
this week
because
for you.
Now we have things.
When we have you talking about that trip, if there's some visuals.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly, and I'll look too. It's good now because now I have stuff I'm looking for as opposed to I just have stuff and I don't have any context to it. So anyway, this is fabulous.
Yeah, you got
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, this was. I mean, I had a wonderful career. I loved my career. We really had a great time in Atlanta, and much of what happened here happened in Atlanta too. But this was an incredibly special time for us here, And when am I off the air or?
You're actually on because it's really good.
Okay.
Whatever you're
Yeah.
gearing up for. Do you want to be on? Yeah.
No,
We'll honor it.
yeah, I think that the hardest part about leaving here was I know that Sue was not an easy time for her coming here. I remember being here for a wedding, Lindsay Snyder's wedding, and I remember getting vested, and I remember Sue saying, there were times, Jim, I thought the best thing to do is build a memorial to you so that people could worship you in the backyard. I don't say that with any degree of pride, and please don't hear it that way. But I think it does reflect how intimate we were together and how much this church impacted my ministry far beyond, I think, than what they realize. They helped me grow up and to mature into what I hope people would say would be a fine parish priest. I remember being nominated for bishop in Northern California and running for bishop, and realizing after that process that I was really called to be a parish priest. My wife would say, Jim, you'd make a great bishop, but you wouldn't be a happy bishop. And much of my happiness of my ministry came from this place. So I love Grace Church.
There's the ending of the video too. Yeah, that's right. Just think about it. I'm sitting here jotting down the whole time. I'm like, there's that, there's that, there's that. So this is just amazing. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Really
You're welcome.
Okay, not too difficult to go back through memory lane about the place. But
No, it's.
seems like
I
it's
mean, it's.
predominantly
It's.
just fond memories.
Yeah, fond memories. I don't.
We won't use the Sioux thing, of course, but
Yeah.
bookended around that are some fantastic thoughts about how the place affected you. But I share what you're feeling. You know, you hate to leave that kind of that weird kind of legacy behind, and at the same time, I can relate to Sue because Ellen, my predecessor, is beloved. So
Right.
I've got to do a lot.
Right.
It's keeps us on our toes. I mean, that's the nature of the priesthood. So
Yeah.
we kind
Yeah.
of have to deal with the shoes that we're given. And
Yeah, I was fortunate. I came into here in a situation where they were ready for new blood.
Right.
To St. Catherine's the same way. So I didn't follow in either place. I didn't follow someone who was
right.
beloved.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know,
It's just how it
and
happens.
it's just how it happens. So anyway, yeah, it's great.
The epitome, though, if you will open yourself to love, they will, in fact.
It's so true. It's really true.
Yeah, people say, what is the meaning of life? To love and to be loved. Who is God? To love and be loved.
Exactly right.
You know, that's what it is. That's what it is. So,
Well, you guys have a dinner, and or if you got time, we can go. Get
I'd love to.
somewhere.
I'd love to.